Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Book Trek, the Summer of Trek, where myself and a bunch of other great booktubers are talking about Star Trek fiction all summer long. No plan other than that. We're not going from franchise to franchise. We're not going from year to year or crew to crew. If you read any Star Trek in the summer of 2023, you are participating in Book Trek, the Summer of Trek. And I want to do a lot of Star Trek videos. I do a lot of Star Trek videos when I participate in Book Trek. Uh, I was forestalled from doing that briefly because I had a house guest. I had a house guest who was a fellow booktuber, Micah Cummins, who, if we are playing the age-old game of assigning Star Trek alien races to our friends, then Micah would certainly be a joined Trill. Young on the outside, very old on the inside. But he was here, and that cut down on the videos that I was willing to make. But now I'm back. He's back home, and I am back on the fainting couch making videos, and that means a return to Book Trek. And I'm embracing the unstructured nature of the summer of Trek, so I am not planning anything for what I do. When I did, what was the event? Well, I've done a couple. I've done a couple of BookTube events where I've done them this way, where basically when I'm setting up my night's reading, I spin a roulette wheel and pick randomly whatever book is going to fit that BookTube event. I'm going to do that, I think, for at least another week on Book Trek. Maybe a pattern or plan will emerge, but one hasn't yet so far. So I did that. I basically did that this time around. The only parameter that I used for last night's Book Trek was that I kind of wanted it to be an ebook. And so I landed on one, and it's one with a fraught history on Book Trek. This is Star Trek The Next Generation, which once upon a time I would have considered a barren duty to read, or I would have skipped it. I believe I skipped this one originally. And that has changed because of Book Trek, because Book Trek has so many Next Generation fans among its hosts and among its viewers, that I decided to just wipe the slate clean and give the whole franchise another try. And it worked. And if it worked before the third season of Star Trek Picard, then the third season of Star Trek Picard would have done it anyway, even if BookTube didn't exist. But I had help, which helped a lot to make the third season of Star Trek Picard really, really land with me. Pretty much a Star Trek fan's dream come true. But I went to a Next Generation novel. And you might think, after all that I've said, that it wouldn't be a tricky thing, but it is. It rips the scab off an old wound on Book Trek. It's a series that went through the 4 Star Trek novels that were coming out every month, once upon a time when there were, for a brief period, 3 Star Trek franchises on TV at the same time, movies going like gangbusters in the theaters. So the novels were coming out in a bombardment, and that was wonderful. And it's by Dean Wesley Smith and Christine Catherine Rush, and it's Star Trek The Next Generation, Soldiers of Fear. This is Invasion, Book 2. And the reason why it's a sore spot on Book Trek is because the series idea was created by a Star Trek writer named Diane Carey, who wrote the first book. And our dauntless captain, Vin, read the first book knowing that Diane Carey is one of my favorite Star Trek authors, and he largely panned it. He slapped it around about the head and neck. And this infuriated me so much that I falsified the ship's computer logs to say that he jettisoned the survey pod when we were still only at yellow alert, long before we'd gone to red alert. He stood court-martial, but Samuel Cogley got him off. What are you going to do? Book people. And that made it a sore spot. I agree that book 1 of Invasion by Diane Carey is not all that great, and I also don't think the concept of this whole overarching story is all that great. The concept is, what if our Starfleet crews, met a group of aliens that looked creepy. That looked not only just randomly creepy, because Bolians look creepy, but looked creepy in the way of old Earth folklore. Maggots crawling out of eyes, witches, devils with horns and red skin, that sort of thing. And I understand the basic organizing principle behind that idea on Diane Carey's part, which was this will tap into the personal aspect of all of our heroes. And also, if there's a vague whiff of the supernatural about these beings, then that might facilitate what was necessary in this 4-part story. And it's tricky. What's necessary in this 4-part story is that it involve all 4 franchises. And that's really, really hard to do. And yet the upper-ups at Pocketbooks wanted there to be regular stories that did that. And the writers liked the challenge of that. How do you involve all 4 franchises? It's easy when it's Deep Space Nine and The Next Generation, because they take place at the same time. They're all their characters overlap. Most of their characters know each other. It's very hard to do that when you want to include the original series and Star Trek Voyager, because the original series is 80 years in the past and Voyager is 80,000 light years away from the Federation. It's on the other side of the galaxy. It's an imaginative feat to come up with a storyline that is going to involve all 4 of those franchises in a month. It will help a lot. Fans loved it, but some of the ideas that writers came up with were a little bit better than others. One that we'll probably be getting to in the summer of Trek involved a weird virus that all of our crews eventually have to deal with because, I guess, illnesses can reoccur. Others more or less successful. One involved the Klingon Day of Honor, which doesn't really necessarily have to directly involve our crews because they're all involved with Klingons in some way or another. But this directly involves our crews. This is a threat to the Federation. A group of aliens from somewhere. They come through a singularity in space. They are called the Furies. And they look like these weird beings, living snakes for hair, that, skull faces, that sort of thing. And they attack the Federation in Diane Carey's first installment of this series. And they are defeated by James Kirk, who is being Kirk. Their defeat is a really well done version of what Jim Kirk brings to a fight that no other of our hero captains do. They all bring things to fights. I'm not saying they're all less than Kirk. I once upon a time would have said that. They all bring things to a fight. If you put all 4 of the marquee, or 5 if you want to include Jonathan Archer, if you put all of them on the bridge of a primitive starship, let's say, no offense to your original series fans, but let's say a Constitution-class starship. So primitive by the lights of most of the others, except Jonathan Archer, who's dealing with basically a space submarine. If you put them on the bridge of a primitive starship, every one of those marquee captains will bring something different to a fight, and that something different will be amazing. There's a reason why they get to be captains of the flagship of the Federation. And Kirk's amazing something, as Diane Carey points out in another one of her own novels, is his uncanny ability to read the mind of his adversaries. So the first book in the series does not end with the Furies conquering the Federation. Obviously, you already know that. That's not a spoiler. But they go back through their little wormhole, and watch stations are put up all around it by the Federation. Listening stations are put up all around it because Kirk and Spock are convinced that they will return someday. And there is your gimmick for involving the rest of the Star Trek franchise, because not Enterprise. This was before Enterprise, but this is your trick for involving everybody else. Because if they're using wormholes to get around, they can go to the Delta Quadrant. They can confront Voyager and Captain Janeway. And if they were beaten by the Federation and tucked away in a wormhole, they could come back to attack the Federation in the Alpha Quadrant, and they do in this book. That's the setup that you need. And I must say, our two authors, do a really good job. You do not need to read the first book in this series to jump in here. And I read this kind of wondering, because despite the scurrilous things that Captain Vin said, I rather like the first book. It's not great Star Trek, but I like the way Diane Carey writes these characters. But these two do a great job. And Once Upon a Time I would have just ground my teeth. I don't think I ever read this. I think I skipped right ahead to the Deep Space Nine volume. Uh, I would have ground my teeth once upon a time at everything that's in here. And now I like it. Now it makes me smile. Captain Jean-Luc Picard is a colder commander than Kirk. He is more likely to reprimand his officers to their faces. It took me a while to realize what's going on here. It's a valid method of leadership, and it's not impersonal. It's just colder. You see that in one of the opening scenes in this book, where Picard is being briefed by an admiral in front of his senior staff, and at one point, the admiral wonders. In the original book, the Furies attack in the heart of Klingon space. It's the Federation has to help them, but it directly involves the Klingons. And in this conference, the admiral that brings Picard the horrible news that the Furies have returned wonders if the Klingons will hold up their end of the bargain. And Worf, Picard's Klingon security officer, says they will, of course. He's not supposed to talk when his captain hasn't given him permission, and he knows that, and Picard knows that. And where if one of Kirk's crew had spoken up, as they easily could have, in a situation like that, McCoy or Scotty might have easily blurted out something. In a situation like that, Kirk would have left it alone. Wouldn't have said anything. The officer himself would have felt bad enough about interrupting. But no big deal would have been made of it. In this scene, before Worf can even fully apologize, Picard tells him that he was out of line, but also tells him that it's understandable. That I would have graded against me. Also, the fact that, Mr. Data, the android lieutenant on board the Enterprise D, of course doesn't have any ancestral fears buried deep inside, as is the trick of this whole gimmick, is that these beings are supposed to be actuating ancestral enemies, ancestral memories, ancestral fears among the humans that deal with them. And Data doesn't have any of those. The tricky part here for all the other segments of Star Trek, if you're going to spread this story over them, is that on the Enterprise there was only one alien, and he was half human. In all these other installments, there are genuine aliens. There are alien beings who don't have any upbringing on Earth. You show them a being with coiled snakes for hair, they're not going to care at all. They might be attracted. And that is definitely true on the Enterprise. I mean, Worf was raised by humans, but he's not human himself. And Deanna Troi is. It's tricky because you've got the complete null point of Data. Data not only does not have these cultural folklore memories, but he doesn't have the emotion of fear. he can't feel afraid anyway. So, and these two authors, who are they again? Dean Wesley Smith and Christine Catherine Rush. Would it kill you to have two names each? And for them to be Irish? Anyway, what they have to deal with here, they do really well, which is that Kirk's time confronting the Furies would be settled history. It's 80 years ago. Which means, as Riker points out at one point in this book, all of the Federation officers have been training for the return of the Furies their whole careers. They might not believe it's ever going to happen. There's a very affecting scene at the very beginning of the book where we meet the crew of the listening station, who are there and monitoring, just completely routine. They've been there for years with no activity at all, when the Furies finally come through. And they don't believe it at first. They're just certain that the one thing it can't be is that, and then that actually does happen. But it's a trickier narrative. There are characters here who don't care what these alien races look like, and also Picard and his crew know what Kirk faced. They are completely prepared, whereas Kirk and his crew had never seen the Furies before. There's a little bit of artificial contrivance, of course, that the Furies don't occur, they don't pop up during the brief career of the Enterprise C, for instance. They don't do that. They appear here because this is where the franchise is. But it's really, really well done. Picard doesn't know what he's headed into, except that when the Admiral informs him of what's going on, he knows we're at war. The standing idea of the Federation is if the Furies ever return, it means war. We don't go there asking what they want. We go there ready for war and under all circumstances to destroy that wormhole. And that tension is conveyed really well all throughout this book. All of the characters from Picard's great bridge crew are in character. And the thing that you kind of sort of expect, once you realize what's going on here, there's something that you kind of sort of expect might be happening, that the Furies might be doing. It might not just be what they look like. And if they are doing something involving fear, well, then the central character for this storyline will not be Data, who doesn't feel any fear. It will be Deanna Troi, who literally can feel the fears of others. And that is done so well. Oh my, that is done so well. This was terrific. Absolutely terrific. It actually makes me want to go on and read the next 2 installments, but I don't think I want to do that right away. That's a little too predictable. I think I'm going to spin the wheel again tonight and see. But this, Soldiers of Fear, I loved it. Just loved it. Now, I don't know. Part of why I loved it might be, well, no, it was a terrific adventure. Much better, I grudgingly have to say, than Diane Carey's first installment. It's possible that my captain, oh my captain, was right about some of its weaknesses. But the jury's still out on whether or not he's a Danebian slime devil. But this was really, really good, and I needed that. And I don't know for sure if there isn't an extra element added on of my appreciation of any Next Generation fiction, because of my appreciation of Star Trek Season 3, Picard Season 3, was just wonderful. It angered me because it showed me that the stupid showrunners for Kurtzman Trek know how to make good Star Trek, which means it just reinforces what I knew all along, which is that all the crappy Star Trek they've made was very intentional. But it also overjoyed me. There was no episode, there was no part of any episode that didn't overjoy me. And maybe that had an effect in making this extra enjoyable. We'll see. The one way to test that, I think, is what I'll do tonight, which is to read another Next Generation novel. I'll pick something years after this or years before it and see if maybe my appreciation of these characters is now filtering over what they're like when they're all in their 100s. But anyway, that's my book trek for today. It's part of a series. I borrowed a page from the book of Sarah, the Bookish Knitter. I read a book in the series out of order, but I really enjoyed it. So I've got good forward momentum here for Book Trek. So we will reconvene tomorrow. We'll see what I have to say then. Thank you, BookTube.